In this video, the Fuji goes toe to toe with the Sony a7S III. In this video, we are going to compare the Sony a7S III to the Fuji X-T4. Can this camera really stand up to the a7S III? Woo-wee! You tell me which one is which here, and don't cheat. Now, Fuji seems to be popping up in my feeds a fair bit on social media and also on YouTube. There seems to be a little bit of hype around this camera, and that's why I wanted to pair it up against the flagship Sony a7S III to see how it would stand up in a real world situation. One of the really interesting things about this camera is it's quite affordable. It's pretty much half the price of the Sony, and you're getting all of those extra features the Sony has in the Fuji. How does that work? Now, from the outset, the Fuji is an APS-C camera and the Sony is a full frame camera. If you've watched this channel before, you will know my thoughts on that particular topic. You can check out the videos up there. That's not going to take away from this video because the Fuji has some really cool things to offer. Now, the first thing, when you look at these images side by side, I pretty much just chucked the LUT on there. We pretty much shot everything on the Fuji in the F-Log and everything in S-Log 2 on the Sony. Now, from the outset, just chucking those LUTs on the two cameras, they are really similar, and I'm really impressed with the Fuji's color science because these colors look absolutely stunning. Now, you are going to see some differences, but from the outset, just putting that LUT on there and the quality and the colors that are coming out of the Fuji really do stand alongside the Sony. This is not a scientific test, this is a real world test. This is us taking both cameras out into the real world and testing them against each other and then comparing the results. Now, we did try and match these cameras up as close as we can considering the lenses that we were going to be using. Obviously, the Fuji has a pretty significant crop factor compared to the Sony, which is full frame. So we tried to adjust that with the lenses we were using. But at the end of the day, what we are looking at here is picture quality, picture sharpness, dynamic range, all that kind of thing. Now let's have a look at these side by sides. So first off, we have the sun coming through these wooden slats. Now, I thought this would be a really good comparison because we get to see those sun flares and a little bit of what's happening with the dynamic range. I was super impressed with the Fuji here. It has great colors, great dynamic range. The only thing I really didn't like about this shot was if you have a look at the sun in the Fuji clip compared to the sun in the Sony clip, the Sony looks so much better. Like the sun flares are just nicer and the sun looks a little bit better. But overall, they're pretty comparable. Now, when it comes to stabilization for the Fuji, you can't really turn the stabilization off. You've always got the body stabilization on. So when we were doing these stabilization tests, the Sony was kind of at a disadvantage because in standard mode, you're really only using the lens stabilization, whereas active, it uses the full body stabilization and gets out those micro jitters. We did, however, try the boost on the Fuji, and apparently you're not really supposed to use that in a very big moving situation. It's kind of more for a handheld shot to get rid of those micro jitters. And that's why in some of the clips you'll see it kind of jolt a little bit. It still does a magnificent job and a really, really good stabilization in the Fuji. And when it comes to the Sony, I absolutely love the stabilization in the Sony. You can pretty much shoot handheld as long as you have active stabilization on. Compared side by side, they're really, really good. I was super surprised how well the Fuji did. I thought this was a category that Sony might win over the Fuji, but... Now, also looking at the side-by-sides of me sitting actually right here, is also very surprising. I was absolutely blown away by the Fuji. I did not think that they would look so similar. Now, to the average Joe Blow, they probably wouldn't even be able to tell a difference, to be honest, but as professionals, you nitpick and you can kind of see different things. And the biggest thing I can see here is the roll-off on the skin tone. So if you look at the Sony, you can kind of see a gradual roll-off on my cheek there. Whereas in the Fuji, it drops pretty harsh. So you've got a lot more contrast in the Fuji, which is expected. I mean, you should have a little bit of difference when it comes to the Fuji and the Sony, when it comes to, you know, dynamic range and stuff like that. So the Fuji does an amazing job. It looks absolutely fantastic, and the roll-off isn't super harsh. It's quite flattering as well. The other thing is also the skin tone color. Now I think the Fuji actually looks a little bit more magenta than the Sony, which was surprising because when we were actually shooting this through the LCD, it looked very green. It looked very, very green. But final results, definitely more natural colors coming out of the Sony when it comes to skin tone. Another thing here which you can really see is the sharpness difference between the Sony and the Fuji. The Fuji has a lot of detail in, you know, the jumper, in the hair, whereas if you look at the Sony, it's quite flattering. It's not that sharp digital look. Now this is obviously something that can be modified in camera just by turning that sharpness down a little bit. The autofocus is really good on the Fuji in like a controlled lighting setting. Like any camera, when there's a big contrast between light and dark, the camera's going to struggle to grab that focus. And I'll show you a couple of clips here of behind the scenes, and you can see that it's just hunting very quickly and kind of even falls away completely. But this can also be fixed like with tuning up your sensitivity on your focus. So you really have to play with that and find the sweet spot. But I think all cameras have that issue when you're in a contrasty situation. It will hunt. I've had it with the Sony as well. But from experience with the Fuji, it is a very good autofocus camera. But I would say that the Sony does pip it at the post here because the Sony has a little bit more technology in it and more refined than the Fuji, but the Fuji is still very, very good. Now when it comes to eye autofocus, the Fuji and the Sony are pretty much, can't tell the difference. Now looking at the color chart, there's also a significant difference in the blacks. Now this comes back to dynamic range and that roll off, and the Fuji is a lot more contrasty than the Sony, I think. The colors are absolutely amazing, they pop, they're great, but I just think the Sony has a little more dynamic range in that fact where you can see kind of the shades of gray, whereas the Fuji just kind of drops off into that black. But when we're looking at the colors, they're beautiful colors from both cameras. Now we also did test out the slow motion in these two cameras. Now from the go-get, the slow motion in the Sony has always had a reputation for being pretty average and pretty muddy, so we'll see how we go. So these two clips, the Sony is in 4K 120 and the Fuji is in HD 200. Now you can really tell a difference obviously when you're shooting in 4K as opposed to HD. So obviously I think the Sony wins hands down here, and that should be the case. When we step up to putting the Sony back into HD, that's where everything changes. So here we have the Sony at 200 frames in HD against the Fuji in HD at 200 frames also. But what you can see here is exactly what I was talking about earlier, is the Sony is very, very muddy and it's just not as sharp as the Fuji. The Fuji is actually really outstanding in the slow-mo, which is surprising because normally when you drop down to HD in the slow-mo, a lot of cameras have real issues with sharpness and just holding that image quality together, but the Fuji just has really stepped up. Now another thing we tested was rolling shutter. Now this was also a real big surprise. Sony did really, really well. I was actually quite impressed with this, and so it should. It has very good rolling shutter. When it came to the Fuji, it did have a slight little roll there, but for what you're paying for this camera, I think the rolling shutter is really good. It's not too bad. It's very usable. Once again, this camera is just keeping ticking those boxes. Now, still photography. This is where the conflict lies. Now, obviously the Sony only has 12 megapixels. It's not meant to be a photo camera, whereas the Fuji is kind of marketed as a hybrid camera. And it can do 26.1 megapixels. Now that's more than double of what the Sony can do. So let's have a look. Now I have to say, I'm really impressed with how the Sony actually held up to this 26.1 megapixel camera. it's done well. I was expecting the Fuji to blow it out of the water, but these stills are really, really good. You really only notice a big difference when you punch into 10 times zoom. Here's one at 5 times, and you know, the quality's pretty comparable, I think. But when you get into that 10 times zoom, that's when the Sony kind of falls away. You can really tell that the Fuji has a 26 megapixels. So that was expected. The Sony is still a great stills camera, but you just have to do your composition in camera. Like, you don't really want to be cropping too much, and you don't want to blow your stills up huge. For this one, I think the colors are absolutely amazing in both cameras. The Fuji colors are still outstandingly amazing. I'm really, really impressed with the Fuji colors, because color in cameras is something that is really important. If you have shit colors in your camera, there's no coming back from that. So your camera has to have good color science from the beginning. And that's why we originally went with the Sony, because their color science had improved so much. But the Fuji is just, you know, from left field here with this these amazing colors and a great little package. So the main differences between these two cameras, and I guess the negatives from the Fuji, would be obviously being an APS-C camera from my perspective. Just figuring out all those crops for each different thing could be a little bit frustrating for me. You got to figure out which lenses you're going to be using, and then if you want to use the 4K, it's going to crop in additionally, so you are losing a lot of that lens. So you just have to keep that in mind. The Fuji cannot do 50 in all eye, but I really don't think this is such a big issue unless you're really pixel peeping. The stabilization is really good in both cameras. I think that the fact of not being able to turn the stabilization off in the Fuji is a bit of a downer, because sometimes you just don't want any stabilization messing around with your stuff. So yeah, I would have liked to just be able to turn all the stabilization off. So who is the Fuji for? Well, I think the Fuji is a great videography camera. It's also a fantastic stills camera. It's a great all-round hybrid camera. You could also use this professionally if you wanted. It does have that APS-C crop, so as long as you can deal with that yourself with, you know, managing lenses and focal lengths and stuff like that, then this camera would be great. It's a great all-round camera. It has great color science, has great video specs, the slow-mo's great. It is an all-round very good camera for the price. So is the Fuji better than the Sony? Not quite, but it's very close. For the price, it's right up there. If it was full frame, whew, the Sony would be in trouble. Ooh, damn. And that's it for the video, guys. If you did like the video, please like, subscribe, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.